Welcome to Murder Midnight, a crime storytelling channel for sleeping, where crime meets calm and mystery meets the mind at rest. Tonight we have another true crime special, focusing on more famous American cases that leave us speechless. Before we close our eyes and start, please comment what country you are tuning in from. It will greatly help us here at Murder Midnight. Story 1. The University of Texas Tower shooting, August 1st, 1966. At 11:48 a.m. on August 1st, 1966, the crack of rifle fire echoed across the University of Texas campus in Austin as Charles Joseph Whitman began what would become one of the most infamous mass shootings in American history. From his perch on the 28th floor observation deck of the iconic UT Tower, the 25-year-old former Marine sniper methodically picked off students, faculty, and visitors with deadly precision, turning the normally peaceful campus into a war zone that would forever change how America viewed mass violence and school safety. By the time police officers reached Whitman 96 minutes later, he had killed 17 people and wounded 31 others, making it the deadliest mass shooting by a lone gunman in U.S. history at that time. But the horror had actually begun hours earlier in the pre-dawn darkness, when Whitman had murdered his mother and wife in their homes before making his way to the university campus with a cache of weapons and ammunition. The massacre would shock the nation and mark the beginning of the modern era of mass shootings in America. Charles Joseph Whitman was born on June 24th, 1941, in Lake Worth, Florida, the eldest of three sons in what appeared from the outside to be a successful middle-class family. His father, Charles Adolphus Whitman Jr., was a successful plumbing contractor who had built a prosperous business and provided his family with comfortable living conditions. However, beneath this facade of success lay a household marked by violence, control, and emotional abuse that would profoundly shape young Charles's development. Charles Sr. was a domineering and violent man who ruled his family through fear and intimidation. He regularly beat his wife and children, often for minor infractions or perceived slights, and maintained rigid control over every aspect of their lives. He expected perfection from his sons and reacted with explosive anger when they failed to meet his impossibly high standards. Despite the abuse, Charles Jr. excelled in many areas during his childhood and adolescence. He was an Eagle Scout, a talented pianist, and an excellent student who demonstrated remarkable intelligence and discipline. He was also fascinated by weapons and became skilled in their use, a talent that would prove tragically significant later in his life. At age 18, Charles enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps, perhaps seeking to escape his father's control and prove his worth as a man. The Marines seemed to provide the structure and discipline that appealed to his personality, and he excelled in military training. He became a sharpshooter and scored 215 out of a possible 250 points in marksmanship training, qualifying him as one of the Corps' most skilled marksmen. However, Whitman struggled with the military's authority structure and had several disciplinary problems during his service. He was court-martialed for assault and gambling, and his relationship with superior officers was often strained. Despite these difficulties, he was accepted into a prestigious Marine Corps program that allowed him to attend college while serving in the reserves. In 1961, Whitman enrolled at the University of Texas at Austin as an engineering student, funded by the Marine Corps program. Initially, he appeared to be thriving in the college environment. He was an excellent student, made friends easily, and seemed to be building the foundation for a successful career. In 1962, he married Kathy Leisner, a fellow UT student who was studying education. However, by 1963, Whitman's behavior began to change dramatically. He started having academic difficulties. His grades declined, and he became increasingly moody and unpredictable. His marriage to Kathy, while appearing happy on the surface, was marked by periods of tension and emotional volatility. When Whitman's performance in the Marine program fell below acceptable standards, he was recalled to active duty and assigned to a base in North Carolina. This setback devastated Whitman, who saw it as a failure and a betrayal by the military system he had trusted. His time back on active duty was marked by further disciplinary problems and increasingly erratic behavior. In 1964, Whitman was discharged from the Marines and returned to UT to complete his degree. However, he never fully recovered from what he perceived as his military failure, and his mental state continued to deteriorate. He began experiencing severe headaches, episodes of rage, and periods of depression that interfered with his ability to function normally. Friends and family members noticed significant changes in Whitman's personality during this period. The formerly disciplined and controlled young man became increasingly impulsive and angry. He would fly into rages over minor provocations and began talking about violence in ways that disturbed those around him. By early 1966, Whitman's mental health had deteriorated to the point where he was actively seeking help. On March 29, 1966, he visited Dr. Maurice Dean Heatley, a psychiatrist at the University of Texas, seeking treatment for what he described as overwhelming periods of hostility and thoughts of violence. During his session with Dr. Heatley, Whitman made statements that, in retrospect, were clear warning signs of the violence to come. He told the psychiatrist that he was having thoughts about going up on the tower with a deer rifle and shooting people. This specific reference to the UT Tower and his intention to shoot people represented a direct threat that should have triggered immediate intervention. However, Dr. Heatley apparently did not take Whitman's statement seriously enough to warrant emergency action. The psychiatrist noted Whitman's comments in his records, but did not hospitalize him, notify authorities, or take other preventive measures. Whitman was scheduled for follow-up appointments, but he never returned for further treatment. This failure to properly assess and respond to Whitman's threats would later be seen as a critical missed opportunity that might have prevented the massacre. The case would become a landmark example of the importance of taking threats of violence seriously and would influence how mental health professionals approach patients who express violent fantasies. In addition to his psychiatric consultation, Whitman exhibited other warning signs in the months leading up to the shooting. He began accumulating weapons and ammunition, purchasing several rifles and handguns along with large quantities of bullets. He also studied the UT Tower extensively, visiting it multiple times and learning about its layout and security procedures. The weekend before the shooting, Whitman's behavior became increasingly erratic and alarming. He had been experiencing severe headaches that he described as excruciating, and his wife Kathy was becoming concerned about his mental state. She had gone to visit her family in Texas, leaving Whitman alone in their apartment. On July 31st, 1966, Whitman's father called to inform him that he and his wife were getting divorced, news that seemed to trigger something in Whitman's already fragile psyche. That evening, he began typing what would become known as his suicide note, a rambling document that provided insight into his disturbed mental state. In the note, Whitman wrote, "I don't really understand myself these days. I am supposed to be an average, reasonable, and intelligent young man. However, lately, I cannot recall when it started, I have been a victim of many unusual and irrational thoughts. These thoughts constantly recur, and it requires a tremendous mental effort to concentrate on useful and progressive tasks." The note continued, "After my death, I wish that an autopsy would be performed on me to see if there is any visible physical disorder. I have had tremendous headaches in the past and have consumed countless numbers of painkillers. I have decided to kill my wife after I pick her up from work. I love her dearly, and she has been as fine a wife to me as any man could ever hope to have. I cannot pinpoint any specific reason for doing this." In the early hours of August 1st, 1966, Whitman put his plan into action. Shortly after midnight, he drove to his mother's apartment, where he found her watching television. Using a knife and rifle, he killed her, later writing in a note left at the scene, "I have just killed my mother. If there's a heaven, she is going there. If there's not a heaven, she is out of her pain and misery." Whitman then returned to his own apartment, where he waited for his wife Kathy to return from her job at the telephone company. When she arrived home around 1 a.m., Whitman killed her with multiple stab wounds as she slept. He left another note explaining his actions. "I have just killed my wife. I love her very much and have been a good husband to her." After killing his wife, Whitman spent the remaining pre-dawn hours preparing for what he knew would be his final day. He gathered his weapons and ammunition, loaded his car with supplies, and wrote additional notes explaining his intentions. He also called in sick to his job at the university and made other preparations to ensure he would not be missed until it was too late to stop him. At approximately 11:30 a.m. on August 1st, Whitman arrived at the University of Texas campus, parking his car near the main building that housed the iconic UT Tower. The tower, completed in 1937, stood 307 feet tall and served as both the university's primary administrative building and its most recognizable landmark. Whitman entered the building carrying a Marine footlocker filled with weapons and ammunition, along with other supplies he would need for his planned siege. He told anyone who questioned him that he was delivering equipment for a research project, and his clean-cut appearance and confident demeanor allowed him to pass without suspicion. Using the elevator, Whitman rode to the 27th floor of the tower, then climbed the stairs to the 28th floor, where the public observation deck was located. The observation deck was a popular tourist destination that normally offered visitors spectacular views of the Austin area and the university campus. Upon reaching the 28th floor, Whitman encountered the tower's receptionist, Edna Townsley, a 47-year-old woman who had worked at the university for many years. Without warning, Whitman attacked her with the butt of his rifle, fracturing her skull and killing her. He then barricaded the stairway to prevent anyone from reaching the observation deck. When a group of visitors, including a family with 2 young children, arrived at the reception area, Whitman opened fire with a shotgun, killing 16-year-old Mark Gabor and his aunt, Marguerite Lamport, and wounding the boy's parents and uncle. The other visitors, including tourists Michael and Mary Gabor, were also shot, though some managed to survive by hiding in nearby offices. At approximately 11:48 a.m., Whitman emerged onto the observation deck of the tower and began the systematic shooting spree that would terrorize the campus for the next hour and a half. From his elevated position, he had an unobstructed view of the campus and surrounding areas, allowing him to target people at distances of up to 500 yards. Whitman had chosen his position carefully. The observation deck provided him with excellent cover and concealment, while its height gave him command of the entire area below. He had brought 3 rifles with him: a 6mm Remington bolt-action rifle with a telescopic sight, a .35 caliber rifle, and a .30 caliber carbine, along with a shotgun and several handguns. His first victim on the observation deck was pregnant Claire Wilson, an 18-year-old anthropology student who was walking across the campus mall with her boyfriend, Thomas Ekman. Whitman's shot struck Wilson in the abdomen, killing her unborn child and critically wounding her. Ekman was killed instantly as he bent down to help Wilson. The sound of rifle fire initially confused many people on campus, who thought it might be construction work or some other normal activity. However, as more shots rang out and people began falling, it became clear that something terrible was happening. Panic spread across the campus as students, faculty, and visitors sought cover wherever they could find it. For the next 96 minutes, Whitman methodically targeted anyone who moved within his field of fire. His military training and marksmanship skills made him devastatingly effective, and his elevated position made it nearly impossible for anyone to approach him safely. Among his victims were Paul Bolton Sontag, an 18-year-old student who was shot while seeking cover behind a construction barrier; Roy Del Schmidt, a 29-year-old electrician who was killed while working on campus; Claudia Rutt, a 27-year-old student who was shot while taking cover behind a tree; Robert Boyer, a 33-year-old mathematician who was killed while attempting to help wounded victims. Whitman's shooting was not random, but appeared to follow a deliberate pattern. He seemed to target people who were trying to help wounded victims, those who were seeking cover, and anyone who presented a clear shot from his position. His accuracy was remarkable. Most of his shots found their intended targets, even at extreme distances. The university and local authorities were initially unprepared for such an unprecedented situation. There were no established protocols for dealing with a mass shooting, and the first responders who arrived on scene were equipped with standard police weapons that were inadequate for engaging a sniper in an elevated position. As word of the shooting spread, the campus was evacuated and the surrounding area was cordoned off. Emergency medical personnel were called to treat the wounded, but many victims remained in the open where Whitman could continue to target them. Some wounded people lay in the scorching Texas heat for hours, unable to be rescued due to the ongoing sniper fire. As the siege continued, law enforcement agencies from throughout the Austin area responded to assist. However, the unique nature of the situation presented challenges that no one had anticipated. Traditional police tactics were ineffective against a sniper in such an elevated position, and early attempts to reach Whitman were unsuccessful. One of the first major efforts to stop Whitman came from an unlikely source: civilian aircraft. Several private pilots volunteered to fly over the tower in an attempt to distract or disable the sniper. One pilot, Jim Boutwell, flew close enough to the tower that Whitman fired at his aircraft, but Boutwell was able to return fire with a shotgun, though without apparent effect. On the ground, police officers and armed civilians began returning fire at Whitman's position. While most of these shots were ineffective due to the distance and angle involved, they did succeed in keeping Whitman pinned down and limiting his ability to acquire new targets. Austin police officer Houston McCoy and civilian Alan Crum positioned themselves with high-powered rifles in locations around the campus and began engaging Whitman from long range. While they were unable to hit him directly, their fire forced him to take cover and reduced his effectiveness as a sniper. By 1 p.m., it was clear that the situation required a direct assault on the tower. Austin police officers Houston McCoy and Ramiro Martinez, along with civilian Alan Crum, volunteered to attempt to reach the observation deck and confront Whitman directly. The three men made their way into the tower building and began climbing the stairs toward the observation deck. This was an extremely dangerous mission, as they would be exposed to Whitman's fire once they reached the higher floors, and they had no way of knowing exactly where he was positioned or what weapons he might have. As they climbed, they could hear continued gunfire from the observation deck, indicating that Whitman was still active and dangerous. When they reached the 27th floor, they discovered the bodies of Whitman's victims in the reception area and realized the full scope of what they were facing. Officer Martinez reached the observation deck first and encountered Whitman, who was positioned behind the tower's architectural features for protection. In the brief firefight that followed, Martinez fired his revolver at Whitman while Officer McCoy provided cover with a shotgun. At 1:24 p.m., Charles Whitman was killed by gunshots fired by the two officers. His 96-minute reign of terror was finally over, but the damage he had inflicted would last forever. The final toll of Whitman's rampage was devastating. 17 people killed, including his mother and wife, and 31 wounded. The victims ranged in age from an unborn child to middle-aged adults and included students, faculty, staff, and visitors who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The wounded were rushed to hospitals throughout Austin, where medical personnel worked frantically to save lives and treat injuries. Some victims would never fully recover from their wounds, while others would carry both physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The investigation that followed revealed the full extent of Whitman's preparation and planning. In addition to the weapons he had brought to the tower, investigators found that he had acquired enough supplies to sustain a much longer siege if necessary. His apartment contained additional weapons, ammunition, and detailed plans for the attack. Following Whitman's death, an autopsy was performed as he had requested in his suicide note. The examination revealed a significant finding: a small brain tumor located in the hypothalamus region of Whitman's brain. The tumor was about the size of a nickel and was pressing against parts of the brain that control emotional regulation and aggressive behavior. This discovery sparked intense debate among medical experts about whether the tumor could have contributed to Whitman's violent behavior. Some neurologists argued that the location and size of the tumor could have affected his personality and judgment, possibly explaining his transformation from a disciplined young man to a mass killer. However, other experts disagreed, pointing out that similar tumors in other patients had not resulted in violent behavior. They argued that while the tumor might have contributed to Whitman's headaches and other physical symptoms, it was unlikely to have been the primary cause of his actions. The debate over the tumor's significance continues to this day, with no definitive consensus among medical professionals. What is clear is that Whitman's case was complex and involved multiple factors, including his abusive childhood, military experiences, academic failures, and deteriorating mental health. The University of Texas Tower shooting marked a turning point in American awareness of mass violence and fundamentally changed how the nation viewed school safety. Prior to 1966, mass shootings were extremely rare, and the idea of someone targeting innocent people in an educational setting was almost unthinkable. The shooting had immediate and lasting effects on university campuses across the country. Security measures were enhanced, emergency response protocols were developed, and law enforcement agencies began training for similar scenarios. The UT Tower itself was closed to public access for many years following the shooting. The incident also influenced popular culture and media coverage of mass violence. The extensive television and newspaper coverage of the shooting established patterns of media response that would be repeated in future mass casualty events. The tower shooting provided crucial lessons for law enforcement agencies about responding to mass casualty incidents. The initial confusion and lack of coordination among responding agencies highlighted the need for better communication and command structures during major emergencies. The successful assault on the tower by officers McCoy and Martinez became a model for future tactical responses to similar situations. Their courage and tactical skill demonstrated that direct action, while extremely dangerous, could be effective in stopping active shooters. The incident also showed the importance of community response, as armed civilians played important roles in returning fire and assisting with the tactical response. This aspect of the case would later influence debates about civilian participation in emergency response situations. The tower shooting created a community of survivors and victim families who would carry the trauma of that day for the rest of their lives. Many survivors suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though such conditions were not well understood at the time. Claire Wilson, the pregnant student who was among the first victims, survived her wounds but lost her unborn child. She would later become an advocate for gun violence prevention and would work to preserve the memory of the victims. The families of those killed struggled with grief and trauma, often receiving little support or counseling in an era when such services were limited. Many would later advocate for better victim services and support systems for those affected by mass violence. The University of Texas implemented numerous changes following the shooting, both to improve security and to memorialize the victims. The tower observation deck was closed to public access, and security throughout the campus was enhanced. In later years, the university would install memorial plaques and create other tributes to honor those who were killed and wounded. The tower itself became a symbol of both tragedy and resilience, representing the university's ability to overcome trauma and continue its educational mission. The University of Texas tower shooting established patterns and raised questions that continue to be relevant in discussions of mass violence today. Issues such as the role of mental illness, access to firearms, media coverage, and emergency response protocols all became subjects of ongoing debate following the incident. The case also highlighted the importance of threat assessment and intervention, particularly in light of Whitman's consultation with a psychiatrist just months before the shooting. The missed opportunity to prevent the tragedy by taking his threats seriously would influence how mental health professionals approach potentially dangerous patients. The University of Texas tower shooting on August 1st, 1966, represents a watershed moment in American history, marking the beginning of the modern era of mass shootings and forever changing how the nation thinks about public safety and violence. Charles Whitman's 96-minute assault from the UT Tower killed 17 people and wounded 31 others, creating trauma that would last for generations. The case revealed complex factors that can contribute to mass violence, including mental illness, personal trauma, access to weapons, and institutional failures. Whitman's transformation from an accomplished young man to a mass killer demonstrated how multiple stressors and psychological factors could combine with devastating results. The heroic response of law enforcement officers Houston McCoy and Ramiro Martinez, along with civilian volunteer Alan Crum, showed that such tragedies could be stopped through courage and decisive action. Their successful assault on the tower became a model for future tactical responses to active shooter situations. The tower shooting also highlighted the importance of community response and resilience in the face of mass violence. The University of Texas campus and the city of Austin demonstrated remarkable strength in recovering from the tragedy and working to prevent future incidents. Today, more than 50 years after the shooting, the lessons learned from that terrible day continue to influence emergency response protocols, campus security measures, and discussions about preventing mass violence. While the tragedy cannot be undone, the memory of those who died and the courage of those who responded continues to serve as both a warning and an inspiration for future generations. The University of Texas Tower stands today as both a monument to education and progress and a reminder of the fragility of peace and security. The events of August 1st, 1966, serve as a permanent reminder that vigilance, preparedness, and community solidarity are essential elements in protecting society from those who would do harm to innocent people. Story 2. The Appalachian Meeting Raid, November 14th, 1957. On the crisp autumn afternoon of November 14th, 1957, New York State Police Sergeant Edgar Croswell was conducting routine patrol duties in the small rural town of Appalachian when he noticed an unusual number of expensive cars with out-of-state license plates gathering at the estate of Joseph Joe the Barber Sr. What Croswell discovered that day would shatter the long-standing myth that organized crime in America was merely a collection of local gangs, and would expose, for the first time, the existence of a vast, coordinated national criminal organization that the media would soon call La Cosa Nostra, our thing. The accidental discovery of what became known as the Appalachian Meeting would prove to be one of the most significant law enforcement breakthroughs in the fight against organized crime, providing the first concrete evidence that Italian-American crime families across the country were part of a single, hierarchical organization with its own rules, traditions, and structure of authority. The raid and its aftermath would transform how America understood organized crime and would provide law enforcement with the intelligence needed to begin dismantling the criminal empire that had operated in the shadows for decades. Joseph Barber Sr. was the unlikely host of what would become the most famous organized crime gathering in American history. Born in Sicily in 1905, Barber had immigrated to the United States as a young man and had built what appeared to be a legitimate business empire centered around soft drink distribution and beer sales in the Binghamton, New York area. Barber's Canada Dry bottling plant and his various other businesses provided him with a comfortable lifestyle and the appearance of respectability that many organized crime figures sought to cultivate. He owned a sprawling 58-acre estate in the rural town of Appalachian, complete with a large stone house, manicured grounds, and facilities that could accommodate large gatherings of guests. However, beneath Barber's facade of legitimate business success lay connections to organized crime that stretched back decades. He was widely believed to be a capo, or captain, in the crime family led by Stefano Magaddino, which controlled organized crime activities throughout western New York and parts of Canada. Barber's businesses served as fronts for various illegal activities, including gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering. Barber had a long criminal record that included arrests for murder, though he had never been convicted of the most serious charges. In 1933, he had been arrested in connection with the murder of a rival bootlegger, but the charges were dropped when witnesses refused to testify. This pattern of suspected involvement in serious crimes followed by dropped charges due to intimidated witnesses was typical of Barber's career and of organized crime figures of his era. Despite his criminal connections, Barber maintained cordial relationships with local law enforcement and political figures, many of whom viewed him as a successful businessman who occasionally bent the rules but was essentially harmless. This reputation would prove crucial to his ability to host the gathering that would inadvertently expose the national structure of organized crime. By 1957, organized crime in America had evolved significantly from the violent territorial gangs of the Prohibition era. The end of Prohibition in 1933 had forced criminal organizations to find new sources of income, leading them to expand into gambling, labor racketeering, narcotics trafficking, and various forms of white-collar crime. The post-World War II era had been a period of consolidation and growth for organized crime families, as returning veterans provided new recruits, and the booming economy created new opportunities for both legitimate and illegitimate businesses. The families had become more sophisticated in their operations, learning to corrupt officials, infiltrate labor unions, and invest their illegal profits in legitimate businesses. At the same time, the structure of organized crime had become more formalized and hierarchical. The various Italian-American crime families across the country had developed a system of territorial control, with each family operating within defined geographic boundaries, while maintaining relationships with families in other cities for mutual cooperation and dispute resolution. This evolution had largely escaped the attention of law enforcement agencies, which continued to view organized crime as a collection of local problems rather than a national phenomenon. The FBI, under Director J. Edgar Hoover, had been reluctant to acknowledge the existence of organized crime, preferring to focus on bank robbers, kidnappers, and communist subversives who seemed to pose more immediate threats to national security. The lack of federal attention to organized crime had allowed the families to operate with relative impunity, as local law enforcement agencies often lack the resources and expertise to combat sophisticated criminal organizations that operated across state lines. This situation would change dramatically following the events at Appalachian. The gathering at Joseph Barber's estate was prompted by several factors that had created tensions within the organized crime hierarchy and required high-level consultation among family leaders. The most immediate cause was the attempted assassination of Frank Costello, one of the most powerful crime bosses in New York, which had occurred on May 2, 1957. Costello had been shot in the head while entering his Manhattan apartment building, but had survived the attack. The shooting was widely believed to have been ordered by Vito Genovese, who was seeking to take control of Costello's criminal empire. However, the failed assassination had created instability within the New York crime families and had raised questions about territorial boundaries and spheres of influence. Another factor contributing to the need for a high-level meeting was the murder of Albert Anastasia, the boss of what would later be known as the Gambino crime family, who had been shot to death in a Manhattan hotel barbershop on October 25, 1957. Anastasia's murder, also believed to have been ordered by Genovese, had further destabilized the balance of power within organized crime and had created the need for a summit meeting to resolve disputes and prevent a wider war. The timing of the meeting was also influenced by the need to discuss the expanding narcotics trade, which was generating enormous profits, but also attracting unwanted attention from federal law enforcement agencies. Different crime families had varying policies regarding drug trafficking, and there was a need to establish consistent rules and guidelines to minimize the risk of prosecution. Barber's estate in Appalachian was chosen as the meeting site for several practical reasons. The rural location provided privacy and security that would have been difficult to achieve in urban areas, where crime bosses were more likely to be recognized and monitored by law enforcement. Barber's reputation as a legitimate businessman also provided cover for the gathering, which could be explained as a social event or business meeting if discovered. The meeting was scheduled to begin on November 14, 1957, with crime bosses and their associates traveling to Appalachian from across the country. The attendees represented virtually every major organized crime family in the United States, making it the largest gathering of high-level criminals in American history. Among those who attended or were expected to attend were Vito Genovese, the ambitious New York crime boss who was seeking to establish himself as the supreme leader of organized crime; Carlo Gambino, who had taken control of the Anastasia family following the latter's murder; Joe Profaci, the boss of what would later be known as the Colombo family; Tommy Lucchese, leader of the family that bore his name; Stefano Magaddino, Barber's boss and the leader of the Buffalo crime family; Sam Giancana, representing the Chicago crime family; Russell Bufalino, a powerful crime boss from northeastern Pennsylvania. The gathering also included numerous underbosses, lieutenants, and other high-ranking members of various crime families, representing a virtual who's who of organized crime leadership. Many of these men had never been in the same place at the same time, making the meeting a unique opportunity for law enforcement to identify key figures and understand the structure of organized crime. The attendees arrived in expensive cars, Cadillacs, Lincolns, and other luxury vehicles that were status symbols within organized crime circles. Many of the cars bore license plates from different states, reflecting the national scope of the gathering and the distances that participants had traveled to attend. New York State Police Sergeant Edgar Croswell was conducting routine patrol duties on November 14th when he noticed the unusual concentration of expensive cars at the Barber estate. As an experienced law enforcement officer who knew his territory well, Croswell immediately recognized that something significant was happening. Croswell had been keeping an eye on Barber for some time, suspecting that his legitimate businesses were fronts for illegal activities. The sergeant had noticed patterns of unusual activity at the Barber estate and had developed intelligence suggesting that Barber was more than just a successful businessman. When Croswell saw the gathering of expensive cars from multiple states, he suspected that a major criminal meeting was taking place. However, he had no way of knowing the true significance of what he had discovered or the national importance of the individuals who were gathered at the estate. Croswell contacted his supervisor and requested backup, explaining that he wanted to investigate the gathering and identify the attendees. His request was approved, and additional state police officers were dispatched to assist with what initially appeared to be a routine investigation of suspicious activity. The decision to investigate the gathering was based on standard law enforcement procedures rather than any specific intelligence about organized crime. Croswell and his colleagues were simply following their instincts and training, which told them that the unusual gathering warranted closer scrutiny. At approximately 12:40 p.m., Sergeant Croswell and his fellow officers approached the Barber estate to investigate the gathering. Their initial plan was simply to identify the attendees and determine whether any laws were being violated, but they had no idea that they were about to stumble upon one of the most significant organized crime meetings in history. As the police officers approached the estate, lookouts posted by the crime bosses spotted them and raised the alarm. The reaction among the meeting attendees was immediate and panicked. Dozens of well-dressed men began fleeing in all directions, running through the woods and fields surrounding the Barber property in desperate attempts to avoid identification and arrest. The sight of expensively dressed men in silk suits and handmade shoes scrambling through the rural countryside became one of the most iconic images associated with the Appalachian raid. Many of the fleeing crime bosses were middle-aged or elderly men who were not accustomed to physical exertion, and their desperate flight through the woods provided a stark contrast to their usual image of power and authority. Some attendees attempted to escape in their cars, but the police had already begun setting up roadblocks on the routes leading away from the estate. Others tried to hide in the woods or in outbuildings on the property, hoping to avoid detection until the police left the area. The chaos and panic that ensued demonstrated just how seriously the crime bosses viewed the threat of police attention. These were men who controlled vast criminal empires and commanded the loyalty of thousands of associates, yet they were reduced to running through the woods like common criminals to avoid being identified by law enforcement. Despite the attempts of many attendees to escape, the police were able to apprehend and identify 60 men who had been present at the gathering. These identifications would prove to be an intelligence windfall for law enforcement agencies across the country, providing the first comprehensive list of high-ranking organized crime figures and revealing connections between criminal organizations that had previously been unknown. Among those detained were some of the most powerful crime bosses in America, including Vito Genovese, who was found hiding in the woods near the estate, Carlo Gambino, who was stopped while attempting to leave in his car, Joe Profaci, who was also detained while trying to escape, Russell Bufalino, who was found at a nearby motel where he had attempted to hide. The men who were detained provided a wealth of information simply through their presence at the meeting. Law enforcement agencies were able to confirm long-suspected connections between different crime families and to identify key figures who had previously operated in the shadows. The attendees carried large amounts of cash, expensive jewelry, and other items that suggested their involvement in lucrative illegal activities. Many also carried weapons, though they attempted to dispose of these before being detained by police. When questioned about their presence at the estate, the detained men provided various explanations that were obviously fabricated. Some claimed they were visiting Barber because he was ill, others said they were attending a social gathering, and still others insisted they had simply been in the area by coincidence. The explanations provided by the detained crime bosses quickly proved to be inadequate and contradictory. Law enforcement officers noted that many of the men claimed to be visiting Barbara because they had heard he was ill, but their stories didn't match up when compared with each other. Some attendees claimed that they were legitimate businessmen who had gathered for discussions about legal business ventures. However, investigators found it suspicious that so many businessmen from different parts of the country would travel to a remote rural location for a meeting, particularly when many of them had extensive criminal records. The large amounts of cash carried by the attendees also undermined their claims of legitimate business purposes. Many of the men were carrying thousands of dollars in small bills, which was consistent with income from illegal gambling and other criminal activities rather than legitimate business transactions. Background checks on the detained individuals revealed an extensive pattern of criminal associations and activities. Many had been arrested multiple times for various offenses, though convictions were often difficult to obtain due to witness intimidation and police corruption. The investigation also revealed that many of the attendees had lied about their occupations and sources of income. Men who claimed to be involved in legitimate businesses were found to have criminal records and associations that contradicted their stated professions. The Appalachian Raid represented the greatest intelligence breakthrough in the history of organized crime investigation. For the first time, law enforcement agencies had concrete evidence of the national scope and structure of organized crime in America. The list of attendees provided investigators with a roadmap of organized crime leadership, revealing connections between families in different cities and identifying key figures who had previously been unknown to law enforcement. The meeting attendance also demonstrated that organized crime was far more sophisticated and coordinated than had been previously understood. Analysis of the attendees revealed patterns of organization and hierarchy that confirmed the existence of a national criminal conspiracy. The presence of bosses from different regions showed that the various crime families were part of a larger organization with established protocols for communication and cooperation. The raid also provided evidence of the enormous wealth generated by organized crime activities. The expensive cars, clothing, and jewelry displayed by the attendees demonstrated that criminal organizations were generating hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal profits. This intelligence breakthrough would transform law enforcement's approach to organized crime, leading to the development of new investigative techniques and the establishment of specialized units focused on combating criminal organizations. News of the Appalachian Raid generated enormous media attention and public interest, as Americans learned for the first time about the existence of a national organized crime syndicate. The image of well-dressed crime bosses fleeing through the woods captured the public imagination and provided a dramatic symbol of law enforcement's victory over organized crime. Newspaper headlines across the country trumpeted the discovery of what reporters began calling the mafia, though law enforcement officials were careful to avoid using that term due to concerns about accuracy and legal implications. The term La Cosa Nostra would later be adopted as a more precise description of the criminal organization that had been exposed. The public reaction to the raid was a mixture of shock, fascination, and satisfaction that law enforcement had finally struck a blow against organized crime. Many Americans had suspected that criminal organizations were more extensive and powerful than had been officially acknowledged, and the Appalachian Raid confirmed their suspicions. The media coverage also helped to dispel the romantic image of organized crime that had been popularized in movies and books. The sight of crime bosses running through the woods in expensive suits provided a more realistic and less glamorous picture of criminal life. However, the coverage also raised concerns about the extent of organized crime influence in American society and the apparent inability of law enforcement agencies to combat these organizations effectively prior to the accidental discovery at Appalachian. The Appalachian Raid prompted congressional investigations into organized crime that would continue for years and would fundamentally change how the federal government approached the problem of criminal organizations. The McClellan Committee, officially known as the Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor and Management, began extensive hearings on organized crime and labor racketeering. These hearings provided a public forum for examining the structure and activities of organized crime families, and they featured testimony from law enforcement officials, reformed criminals, and other witnesses who could provide insight into the criminal underworld. The congressional investigations revealed the extent to which organized crime had infiltrated legitimate businesses, labor unions, and even government agencies. The hearings showed that criminal organizations were not merely engaged in traditional crimes like gambling and loan sharking, but had also become involved in sophisticated white-collar crimes that affected the broader economy. The investigations also revealed patterns of corruption that had allowed organized crime to flourish. Testimony showed that criminal organizations had systematically corrupted police officers, judges, politicians, and other officials who were supposed to protect the public from criminal activity. These revelations led to calls for comprehensive reforms in law enforcement and government oversight, as well as new legislation designed to combat organized crime more effectively. The Appalachian Raid created significant embarrassment for FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who had long denied the existence of organized crime as a national phenomenon. Hoover had preferred to focus the Bureau's resources on bank robbers, kidnappers, and communist subversives rather than on criminal organizations that he claimed were merely local problems. The overwhelming evidence provided by the Appalachian Raid made it impossible for Hoover to continue denying the existence of organized crime, and the FBI was forced to dramatically change its priorities and investigative focus. The Bureau established new organized crime units and began developing the intelligence and investigative techniques needed to combat sophisticated criminal organizations. However, Hoover's response to the Appalachian revelations was also influenced by his desire to protect the FBI's reputation and his own position. Rather than acknowledging the Bureau's previous failures to recognize the threat posed by organized crime, Hoover claimed that the FBI had been aware of these criminal organizations all along, but had lacked the legal authority to investigate them effectively. The FBI's new focus on organized crime would lead to the development of innovative investigative techniques, including electronic surveillance, undercover operations, and the cultivation of informants within criminal organizations. These techniques would prove crucial in later prosecutions of organized crime figures. While the Appalachian Raid was an intelligent success, it proved more difficult to translate this success into criminal convictions. Most of the attendees were charged only with minor offenses, such as conspiracy to obstruct justice or failure to provide adequate explanations for their presence at the meeting. The prosecution of the Appalachian attendees was complicated by the fact that attending a meeting, even a meeting of criminals, was not itself a crime. Prosecutors had to prove that the attendees had gathered for specific illegal purposes, which was difficult to establish based solely on their presence at the Barber estate. 20 of the attendees were eventually convicted of conspiracy charges, but these convictions were later overturned on appeal when higher courts ruled that the evidence was insufficient to prove that a criminal conspiracy had taken place. The legal setbacks were frustrating for law enforcement, but the intelligence value of the raid far outweighed the limited success in obtaining convictions. The legal difficulties encountered in prosecuting the Appalachian attendees highlighted the need for new laws and investigative techniques specifically designed to combat organized crime. This recognition would eventually lead to the passage of landmark legislation such as the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations (RICO) Act. The Appalachian Raid had profound and lasting effects on organized crime in America, fundamentally changing how criminal organizations operated and how law enforcement approached the problem of combating them. The exposure of the meeting participants made it much more difficult for crime bosses to operate in the shadows, as they now faced increased scrutiny from law enforcement agencies. The raid also disrupted the leadership structure of organized crime by exposing key figures and their relationships to each other. Many of the crime bosses who had attended the meeting found themselves under constant surveillance and investigation, making it difficult for them to conduct their criminal activities effectively. The increased law enforcement attention that followed the raid led many organized crime families to become more cautious and secretive in their operations. The days of large public gatherings like the Appalachian meeting were over, as crime bosses recognized that such events posed unacceptable risks of exposure. However, the raid also demonstrated the resilience of organized crime, as the criminal organizations adapted to the new law enforcement environment and found ways to continue their operations despite increased scrutiny. The families developed new communication methods, changed their organizational structures, and became more sophisticated in their efforts to avoid detection. The Appalachian Raid marked the beginning of a transformation in how American law enforcement agencies approached organized crime. The intelligence gathered at the meeting provided the foundation for decades of investigation and prosecution of criminal organizations. New specialized units were established within federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies to focus specifically on organized crime. These units developed expertise in the unique challenges posed by criminal organizations and created new investigative techniques specifically designed to combat them. The sharing of intelligence between different law enforcement agencies also improved dramatically following the raid. The recognition that organized crime operated across jurisdictional boundaries led to better coordination and cooperation between agencies at all levels of government. Training programs were developed to educate law enforcement officers about the structure and operations of organized crime families. This education helped officers recognize the signs of organized crime activity and understand the methods used by criminal organizations to avoid detection. The Appalachian Raid had significant cultural and social impacts that extended far beyond law enforcement circles. The revelation that organized crime was a national phenomenon with sophisticated organizational structures challenged many Americans' understanding of criminal activity and law enforcement effectiveness. The raid also contributed to a growing awareness of corruption in government and law enforcement, as investigations revealed the extent to which organized crime had infiltrated legitimate institutions. This awareness contributed to demands for greater accountability and transparency in government operations. Popular culture was also influenced by the Appalachian revelations, as books, movies, and television shows began to portray organized crime in more realistic terms. The romantic image of gangsters that had been popular in earlier decades gave way to more serious examinations of the social and economic costs of organized crime. The raid also sparked academic interest in organized crime, leading to scholarly studies of criminal organizations and their impact on society. Researchers began to examine the economic effects of organized crime and the methods used by criminal organizations to maintain power and influence. The Appalachian Meeting Raid of November 14, 1957, stands as one of the most significant law enforcement discoveries in American history, fundamentally transforming the nation's understanding of organized crime and launching a new era in the fight against criminal organizations. What began as a routine patrol by Sergeant Edgar Croswell became an intelligence breakthrough that exposed the existence of a vast, coordinated criminal conspiracy that had operated in the shadows for decades. The sight of dozens of well-dressed crime bosses fleeing through the woods of rural New York provided a dramatic symbol of law enforcement's ability to penetrate the secretive world of organized crime. For the first time, Americans had concrete evidence that Italian-American crime families across the country were part of a single, hierarchical organization with its own rules, traditions, and structure of authority. The intelligence gathered at Appalachian would provide the foundation for decades of investigation and prosecution of organized crime figures, leading to the development of new laws, investigative techniques, and enforcement strategies specifically designed to combat criminal organizations. The raid marked the end of organized crime's ability to operate with impunity and the beginning of sustained law enforcement pressure that would continue for generations. While the immediate legal consequences of the raid were limited, its long-term impact was profound and lasting. The exposure of the meeting participants disrupted the leadership structure of organized crime and forced criminal organizations to become more cautious and secretive in their operations. The increased law enforcement attention that followed the raid would eventually lead to the prosecution and conviction of many of the most powerful crime bosses in America. The Appalachian Raid also demonstrated the importance of alert and dedicated law enforcement officers like Sergeant Croswell, whose instincts and initiative led to one of the greatest intelligence breakthroughs in criminal justice history. The accidental nature of the discovery serves as a reminder that significant law enforcement victories sometimes come from unexpected sources and that routine police work can have extraordinary consequences. Today, more than 6 decades after the raid, the Appalachian Meeting remains a watershed moment in the history of American law enforcement and organized crime. The intelligence gathered on that November afternoon continues to influence how investigators approach criminal organizations, and the lessons learned from the raid have been applied to combat not only traditional organized crime, but also newer forms of criminal conspiracy, such as international drug cartels and terrorist networks. The empty field in Appalachian, where Joseph Barber's estate once stood, serves as a quiet reminder of the day when law enforcement accidentally discovered the secret world of organized crime and began the long process of bringing these criminal organizations to justice. The raid proved that no criminal organization, regardless of its power and influence, could remain hidden forever, and that dedicated law enforcement officers could penetrate even the most secretive criminal conspiracies. Story 3. The McDonald's Massacre, July 18, 1984. The McDonald's restaurant in the quiet border community of San Ysidro, California, was filled with families enjoying lunch on the warm Wednesday afternoon of July 18, 1984. Children played in the restaurant's playground area while parents chatted over Happy Meals and sodas, creating the cheerful atmosphere that had made McDonald's a symbol of American family dining. At 3:56 p.m., this peaceful scene was shattered when James Oliver Huberty walked through the front door carrying 3 firearms and opened fire on everyone inside, beginning what would become one of the deadliest mass shootings in American history. For the next 77 minutes, Huberty methodically hunted down and killed customers and employees throughout the restaurant, showing no mercy for men, women, or children. By the time a police sniper's bullet ended his rampage at 5:17 p.m., 21 people were dead and 19 others wounded, making it the deadliest mass shooting by a single gunman in U.S. history at that time. The massacre would shock the nation, devastate a community, and raise disturbing questions about mental illness, social alienation, and the warning signs of mass violence. James Oliver Huberty was born on October 11, 1942, in Canton, Ohio, to Earl Vincent Huberty and Ruth Huberty. From an early age, James displayed characteristics that would define his troubled personality throughout his life: social awkwardness, difficulty forming relationships, and a quick temper that often erupted into violence. Huberty's childhood was marked by instability and dysfunction. His parents' marriage was troubled, and the family moved frequently, never allowing young James to establish lasting friendships or feel settled in any community. He was often bullied at school due to his awkward social skills and unusual appearance, experiences that left him feeling isolated and resentful. Despite these challenges, Huberty showed academic promise and was particularly gifted in mathematics and technical subjects. After graduating from high school, he attended Malone College in Ohio, where he studied sociology. However, his social difficulties continued to plague him, and he remained an outsider among his peers. In 1965, Huberty married Etna Marklin, whom he had met at college. The marriage provided him with some stability, and the couple eventually had 2 daughters. However, friends and family members later recalled that Huberty was often controlling and had a violent temper, particularly when he felt frustrated or challenged. After college, Huberty worked as a welder, a profession that suited his technical skills and allowed him to work with minimal social interaction. He was known as a competent worker, but was difficult to get along with and had frequent conflicts with supervisors and coworkers. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, Huberty's life became increasingly unstable as he faced a series of personal and professional setbacks that fueled his growing anger and resentment toward society. He lost several jobs due to his difficult personality and poor interpersonal skills, and his family faced ongoing financial difficulties. In 1971, Huberty was involved in a motorcycle accident that left him with injuries to his arm and leg. While the injuries eventually healed, the accident seemed to exacerbate his psychological problems and may have contributed to his increasing instability. He became more paranoid and suspicious of others, often believing that people were plotting against him or trying to take advantage of him. Huberty's mental health deteriorated further as he became obsessed with survivalist ideology and began preparing for what he believed would be an inevitable societal collapse. He stockpiled weapons and ammunition, studied military tactics, and became increasingly isolated from mainstream society. In 1982, facing continued unemployment and financial pressure in Ohio, Huberty made the decision to move his family to California in search of better opportunities. However, the move did not provide the fresh start he had hoped for, and his problems only intensified in the unfamiliar environment. In January 1984, the Huberty family moved to San Isidro, a predominantly Hispanic community located on the U.S.-Mexico border just south of San Diego. Huberty had hoped that the move would provide new employment opportunities and a chance to rebuild his life, but he quickly became frustrated with his circumstances. San Isidro was a working-class community with limited opportunities for someone with Huberty's skills and personality problems. He struggled to find steady employment and became increasingly resentful of what he perceived as preferential treatment for Hispanic workers. His racist attitudes, which had been present throughout his life, became more pronounced as he blamed his employment difficulties on immigration and affirmative action policies. Huberty eventually found work as a security guard, but the job was poorly paid and did little to alleviate his financial stress. He became increasingly paranoid and began to believe that various government agencies were monitoring him and interfering with his life. He complained frequently about what he saw as harassment by the IRS, FBI, and other federal agencies. The family's financial situation continued to deteriorate, and they were forced to live in a small, run-down apartment in a rough neighborhood. Huberty's wife, Etna, found work to help support the family, but this only added to Huberty's sense of failure and emasculation. By the summer of 1984, Huberty's mental state had deteriorated dramatically. He was experiencing severe paranoid delusions, believing that government agents were following him and that various conspiracies were working against him. He became increasingly violent and unpredictable, frightening his family and neighbors with his erratic behavior. Huberty's paranoia focused particularly on what he believed was surveillance by federal agents. He would spend hours watching from his apartment window, convinced that unmarked cars and suspicious individuals were monitoring his activities. He began carrying weapons at all times and talked constantly about defending himself against what he saw as imminent attacks. In the weeks before the massacre, Huberty's behavior became even more disturbing. He talked frequently about violence and death, made threats against various individuals and groups, and expressed his belief that society was irredeemably corrupt and deserved to be destroyed. On July 15, 1984, just 3 days before the massacre, Huberty called a mental health clinic seeking help for his deteriorating psychological condition. However, due to a clerical error, his call was not returned, and he never received the professional help that might have prevented the tragedy that followed. This missed opportunity would later be seen as a critical failure in the mental health system, highlighting the importance of prompt response to individuals seeking help for psychological crises. The failure to return Huberty's call represented a tragic, lost chance to intervene before his violent fantasies became reality. July 18, 1984 began as a typical day for the Huberty family. Etna went to work at her job, while James stayed home with their 2 daughters. However, friends and neighbors later recalled that Huberty seemed more agitated and unpredictable than usual that morning. Around noon, Huberty visited the San Diego Zoo with his family, an outing that seemed normal on the surface, but may have been his way of spending final time with his daughters before carrying out his planned attack. Witnesses later recalled that he seemed tense and distracted during the visit. After returning home from the zoo, Huberty spent time organizing his weapons and preparing for what he apparently knew would be his final act. He had accumulated an arsenal that included a 9mm Uzi semi-automatic carbine, a Winchester 1212 gauge shotgun, and a 9mm Browning pistol, along with hundreds of rounds of ammunition. At approximately 3:30 p.m., Huberty told his wife, "Society had their chance. I'm going hunting, hunting for humans." These chilling words were among the last he would speak to his family before leaving their apartment and walking the few blocks to the McDonald's restaurant where he would carry out his massacre. At 3:56 p.m., James Huberty entered the McDonald's restaurant at 460 West San Isidro Boulevard, a location he had chosen apparently at random, but which would forever be associated with his name. The restaurant was busy with the typical afternoon crowd, families with children, teenagers hanging out after school, and workers grabbing quick meals. Huberty was carrying all 3 of his weapons when he entered the restaurant, though initially many people thought he might be a security guard or law enforcement officer due to his serious demeanor and the presence of the firearms. This confusion may have prevented some potential victims from immediately recognizing the danger they were in. Without warning or provocation, Huberty opened fire on the customers and employees in the restaurant. His first victim was a 16-year-old employee named David Flores, who was shot while working behind the counter. Huberty then systematically began shooting other people throughout the restaurant, showing no discrimination based on age, gender, or ethnicity. The initial shots created chaos and panic as customers and employees realized what was happening. Some people were able to escape through exits, while others hid wherever they could find cover. However, the layout of the restaurant made escape difficult for many, and Huberty positioned himself to control most of the exits. For the next 77 minutes, Huberty methodically hunted down and killed people throughout the McDonald's restaurant. His approach was calculated and deliberate rather than frenzied, suggesting that he was in control of his actions and was carrying out a premeditated plan. Huberty moved through different areas of the restaurant, targeting people who were hiding or trying to escape. He showed particular cruelty toward children, killing several young victims execution style. Among his victims were Omar Hernandez, an 11-year-old boy who was shot while playing in the restaurant's playground area. Jackie Wright, a 17-year-old employee who was killed while trying to hide in the kitchen. Claudia Perez, a 9-year-old girl who was shot while cowering under a table with her family. Huberty's military-style weapons and large ammunition supply allowed him to sustain the attack for an extended period. He had brought hundreds of rounds of ammunition and was able to reload his weapons multiple times during the siege. Throughout the attack, Huberty made various statements that provided insight into his mental state and motivations. Witnesses who survived reported that he talked about his hatred for society, his belief that he was being persecuted, and his desire to make others pay for the injustices he felt he had suffered. The first 911 calls reporting the shooting began coming in shortly after 4 p.m., but the initial police response was hampered by confusion about the exact location and nature of the emergency. Some early reports suggested that the shooting might be taking place at a post office rather than the McDonald's, leading to delays in directing resources to the correct location. When police officers arrived at the McDonald's, they found themselves facing an unprecedented situation. Mass shootings were much less common in 1984 than they would become in later decades, and law enforcement agencies had limited experience and training for such scenarios. The initial responding officers attempted to establish a perimeter around the restaurant and evacuate nearby buildings, but they were limited in their ability to directly confront Huberty due to his superior firepower and defensive position inside the restaurant. As the siege continued, additional resources were called in, including SWAT teams and specialized tactical units. However, the unique challenges presented by the situation, an active shooter in a public place with numerous hostages and victims, required careful planning and coordination. By 5 p.m., it was clear that the situation required immediate action to prevent additional casualties. Huberty had been shooting for over an hour, and the number of victims continued to mount. Police commanders made the decision to authorize the use of deadly force to end the siege. SWAT sniper Chuck Foster was positioned approximately 125 yards away from the restaurant, with a clear view through one of the windows. Foster had been observing Huberty's movements and waiting for a clear shot that would not endanger any potential survivors inside the restaurant. At 5:17 p.m., Foster saw his opportunity when Huberty moved near a window and presented a clear target. Foster fired a single shot from his rifle, striking Huberty in the chest and killing him instantly. The 77-minute reign of terror was finally over. The sniper's shot was remarkably precise, given the distance and the need to ensure that no bystanders were hit. Foster's training and skill under extreme pressure were crucial in ending the massacre and preventing additional casualties. When police and emergency medical personnel finally entered the McDonald's restaurant, they encountered a scene of unprecedented carnage. Bodies were scattered throughout the dining area, kitchen, and playground, while survivors huddled wherever they had found cover during the attack. The final toll was devastating: 21 people killed and 19 wounded, making it the deadliest mass shooting by a single gunman in U.S. history at that time. The victims ranged in age from 8 months to 74 years, representing the cross-section of families and individuals who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Among the dead were Blythe Rager, a 31-year-old mother who was killed while trying to protect her children; Michelle Carncross, an 8-month-old baby who was shot while in her mother's arms; Matao Herrera, a 62-year-old man who was killed while eating lunch with his wife; Carlos Reyes, a 8-year-old boy who died alongside his father. Many of the survivors suffered severe physical injuries that would require months or years of recovery, while others were left with psychological trauma that would last for the rest of their lives. The investigation into the McDonald's massacre revealed the full extent of Huberty's preparation and the warning signs that had been missed in the days and weeks leading up to the attack. Investigators found that Huberty had been planning the attack for some time and had specifically chosen the McDonald's location because of its proximity to his apartment and the large number of people likely to be present. The weapons Huberty used were all legally purchased, highlighting concerns about gun control and the ease with which individuals with mental health problems could acquire firearms. His arsenal included a 9mm Uzi semi-automatic carbine with 223 rounds of ammunition, a Winchester 1212-gauge shotgun with 12 rounds, a 9mm Browning pistol with 58 rounds. Investigators also discovered evidence of Huberty's deteriorating mental state, including writings and statements he had made expressing his hatred for society and his desire to commit violence. The failure of the mental health system to respond to his call for help just days before the massacre became a major focus of the investigation and subsequent reforms. The San Isidro community was devastated by the massacre, which struck at the heart of a close-knit neighborhood where many residents knew each other personally. The McDonald's restaurant had been a popular gathering place for local families, making the attack feel like an assault on the community itself. Many residents struggled with feelings of grief, anger, and vulnerability following the attack. The fact that such violence could occur in their peaceful community shattered their sense of safety and security. Children were particularly affected, as many had difficulty understanding why someone would want to hurt innocent people. The predominantly Hispanic community also faced additional challenges related to discrimination and stereotyping in the aftermath of the shooting. Some media coverage and public commentary unfairly associated the violence with the border location and immigrant population, adding to the community's trauma. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre, the McDonald's Corporation faced difficult decisions about how to handle the site where so many people had died. The company ultimately decided to demolish the restaurant and donate the land to the city of San Isidro for use as a memorial. A small memorial park was constructed on the site, featuring a simple monument listing the names of the victims. However, many community members felt that the memorial was inadequate given the magnitude of the tragedy and the lasting impact on the community. Over the years, various efforts have been made to create more substantial memorials and to ensure that the victims are properly remembered. Annual memorial services are held to honor those who died and to provide support for survivors and family members who continue to cope with their losses. The McDonald's massacre had a significant impact on law enforcement tactics and training for mass casualty incidents. The successful resolution of the siege through the use of a police sniper became a model for future tactical responses to similar situations. However, the incident also highlighted the need for better coordination and communication among different law enforcement agencies during major emergencies. The initial confusion about the location of the shooting and delays in response led to improvements in 911 systems and dispatch protocols. The massacre also contributed to the development of specialized training programs for officers who might face active shooter situations. The concept of immediate response to stop ongoing violence, rather than waiting for specialized units, began to evolve from lessons learned in incidents like the McDonald's shooting. One of the most troubling aspects of the McDonald's massacre was the failure of the mental health system to respond appropriately to Huberty's cry for help just days before the attack. His call to a mental health clinic seeking assistance was not returned due to a clerical error, representing a tragic missed opportunity to prevent the violence. This failure highlighted serious problems in the mental health care system, including inadequate staffing, poor communication procedures, and insufficient resources for individuals in crisis. The incident led to reforms in many mental health facilities to ensure that calls for help are handled more effectively. The case also raised broader questions about the relationship between mental illness and violence, and the responsibilities of mental health professionals to identify and respond to individuals who might pose a danger to themselves or others. The McDonald's massacre received extensive media coverage, making it one of the first mass shootings to be covered intensively by television news. The coverage helped establish patterns of media response to mass violence that would be repeated in future incidents. The intense media attention had both positive and negative effects. On one hand, it helped raise awareness about the problem of mass violence and the need for better mental health services and gun control measures. On the other hand, some critics argued that the extensive coverage might inspire copycat attacks by individuals seeking similar notoriety. The public response to the massacre was characterized by shock, grief, and calls for action to prevent similar tragedies. However, the specific policy responses were limited, and many of the underlying issues that contributed to the violence remained unaddressed. The families of the victims and survivors faced numerous legal and financial challenges in the aftermath of the massacre. While some victims' families filed lawsuits against various parties, including the mental health clinic that failed to return Huberty's call, the legal remedies available were limited. The McDonald's Corporation provided some financial assistance to victims and their families, but many felt that the compensation was inadequate given the magnitude of their losses. The company's decision to demolish the restaurant and donate the land was seen as appropriate by some but insufficient by others. Workers' compensation and victim assistance programs provided some support, but many families struggled with ongoing medical expenses, lost income, and other financial consequences of the tragedy. The psychological impact of the McDonald's massacre on survivors was profound and lasting. Many developed post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and other mental health conditions that required ongoing treatment. Some survivors were never able to fully recover from their experiences, and continued to struggle with the trauma for years afterwards. Children who survived the attack faced particular challenges, as they had difficulty understanding and processing the violence they had witnessed. Many required extensive counseling and support to help them cope with their experiences and rebuild their sense of safety and security. Some survivors became advocates for gun control, mental health reform, and victim rights, using their experiences to try to prevent similar tragedies. Others preferred to maintain their privacy and focus on their personal healing and recovery. The McDonald's massacre had a significant impact on American popular culture, inspiring numerous books, documentaries, and other works that examine the incident and its broader implications. The case became a touchstone for discussions about mass violence, mental illness, and social alienation. The massacre also influenced the entertainment industry's portrayal of mass violence and helped establish many of the tropes and narrative patterns that would be used in later depictions of similar incidents. However, some critics argued that fictional portrayals of mass violence could contribute to the problem by glorifying or sensationalizing such acts. The McDonald's massacre occurred during a period when mass shootings were becoming more frequent and deadly in the United States. The incident can be seen as part of a broader pattern of mass violence that includes other notable cases such as the University of Texas Tower shooting in 1966 and later incidents at Columbine High School and Virginia Tech. Comparing the McDonald's massacre to other mass shootings reveals both similarities and differences in the perpetrators' backgrounds, methods, and motivations. Like many other mass shooters, Huberty had a history of mental illness, social isolation, and grievances against society that he expressed through violence. However, the McDonald's massacre was notable for its random targeting of victims and its location in a family restaurant, which made it particularly shocking to the American public. The incident helped establish the modern understanding of mass shootings as unpredictable acts of violence that could occur anywhere. The McDonald's massacre raised important questions about how society can identify and prevent mass violence before it occurs. The case highlighted the importance of mental health services, gun control measures, and threat assessment programs in preventing similar tragedies. However, the specific policy responses to the massacre were limited, and many of the underlying issues that contributed to the violence remained unaddressed. The incident occurred during a period when public policy attention to mass violence was still developing, and the tools and resources available for prevention were limited. The case did contribute to growing awareness of the problem of mass violence and helped build support for some reforms in mental health services and law enforcement training. However, broader policy changes related to gun control and violence prevention would not occur until after later, even more deadly incidents. The McDonald's massacre provided important lessons about mass violence that continue to be relevant today. Mental health crisis response. The failure to respond to Huberty's call for help demonstrated the critical importance of effective crisis intervention services and the need for mental health systems to be responsive to individuals in distress. Warning signs. Huberty exhibited numerous warning signs before the attack, including threats of violence, paranoid delusions, and social isolation. The case highlighted the importance of recognizing and responding to such warning signs. Law enforcement response. The successful resolution of the incident through the use of a police sniper provided a model for tactical responses to active shooter situations, though it also highlighted the need for better coordination and communication among responding agencies. Community impact. The profound and lasting impact of the massacre on the San Isidro community demonstrated the need for comprehensive support services for communities affected by mass violence. Media responsibility. The extensive media coverage of the incident raised questions about the responsible reporting of mass violence and the potential for coverage to inspire copycat attacks. The McDonald's massacre in San Isidro on July 18, 1984, stands as one of the most tragic and significant mass shooting incidents in American history. James Oliver Huberty's 77-minute rampage claimed 21 lives and wounded 19 others, forever changing a peaceful community and contributing to the nation's growing awareness of the threat posed by mass violence. The case revealed the complex factors that can contribute to mass violence, including mental illness, social isolation, access to weapons, and the failure of support systems designed to help individuals in crisis. Huberty's transformation from a troubled but functioning member of society to a mass killer demonstrated how multiple stressors and psychological factors can combine with devastating results. The heroic response of SWAT sniper Chuck Foster, whose precise shot ended the massacre, showed that such tragedies can be stopped through skilled and courageous law enforcement action. The incident became a model for tactical responses to active shooter situations and contributed to the development of modern law enforcement training and protocols. The McDonald's massacre also highlighted the importance of mental health services and the tragic consequences that can result when individuals seeking help are unable to access appropriate care. The failure to return Huberty's call for help just days before the attack remains a haunting reminder of how small failures in support systems can have enormous consequences. For the survivors and families of victims, the massacre represents a permanent loss that no amount of time can fully heal. Their courage in rebuilding their lives and their efforts to prevent similar tragedies serve as testaments to the human capacity for resilience in the face of unimaginable trauma. Today, nearly 4 decades after the massacre, the empty lot in San Isidro where the McDonald's once stood serves as a quiet memorial to those who died and a reminder of the ongoing need for vigilance against mass violence. The lessons learned from that terrible day continue to influence discussions about mental health, gun violence, law enforcement response, and community resilience. The McDonald's massacre cannot be undone, but the memory of its victims and the lessons learned from the tragedy continue to serve as important guides for efforts to prevent mass violence and protect innocent people from those who would do them harm. In a world where mass shootings have unfortunately become more common, the San Isidro massacre remains a sobering reminder of the human cost of such violence and the ongoing need for comprehensive approaches to prevention and response. Story 4, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, February 14, 1929. The morning of February 14, 1929, dawned cold and gray in Chicago, with fresh snow covering the streets of the north side. At 2122 North Clark Street, in a nondescript brick warehouse that served as the headquarters for George Bugs Moran's bootlegging operation, 7 men gathered for what they believed would be a routine business meeting about a shipment of hijacked whiskey. Instead, at approximately 10:30 a.m., they would become victims of the most infamous gangland execution in American history, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The brutal slaying of 7 men, gunned down in cold blood by assailants dressed as police officers, would shock the nation and mark the pinnacle of Al Capone's violent reign over Chicago's underworld. The massacre would also signal the beginning of the end for the freewheeling gangster era of Prohibition, as public outrage over the brazen violence finally forced law enforcement and political leaders to take serious action against organized crime. To understand the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, one must first understand the unique conditions that Prohibition created in Chicago during the 1920s. The 18th Amendment, which banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages, had gone into effect on January 17, 1920, creating an enormous illegal market that organized crime was perfectly positioned to exploit. Chicago, with its strategic location as a transportation hub, its corrupt political machine, and its large immigrant population, became the epicenter of bootlegging operations in the Midwest. The city's proximity to Canada, where alcohol remained legal, made it an ideal entry point for smuggled liquor, while its extensive network of speakeasies provided countless outlets for distribution. By the mid-1920s, the illegal alcohol trade in Chicago was generating hundreds of millions of dollars annually, creating unprecedented opportunities for criminal organizations willing to use violence to protect their territory and eliminate competition. The enormous profits at stake led to increasingly brutal warfare between rival gangs, as each sought to expand their share of the lucrative market. The violence was facilitated by the widespread corruption of Chicago's police and political establishment. Prohibition had created a situation where the law itself was widely viewed as illegitimate, and many officials were willing to accept bribes in exchange for looking the other way. This created an environment where criminal organizations could operate with virtual impunity as long as they were willing to share their profits with the right people. At the center of Chicago's criminal empire stood Alphonse Gabriel Capone, better known as Scarface Al, who by 1929 had become the most powerful and notorious gangster in America. Born in Brooklyn in 1899 to Italian immigrant parents, Capone had come to Chicago in 1919 at the invitation of his mentor, Johnny Torrio, who recognized the young man's combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and organizational skills. Capone quickly rose through the ranks of Torrio's organization, demonstrating a talent for both violence and business that would serve him well in the bootlegging trade. When Torrio retired in 1925 following an assassination attempt, Capone took control of what was already Chicago's largest criminal organization. Under Capone's leadership, the organization expanded rapidly, eventually controlling much of the alcohol distribution in Chicago and the surrounding area. Capone's success was built on a simple but effective strategy. He offered better products at competitive prices while using violence to eliminate competitors who threatened his market share. Capone understood that success in the bootlegging business required more than just criminal skills. It also required political connections and public relations acumen. He cultivated relationships with corrupt politicians and police officials, ensuring that his operations faced minimal interference from law enforcement. At the same time, he maintained a public image as a successful businessman, claiming to be merely providing a service that the public wanted. However, Capone's empire was built on violence, and he was willing to use extreme brutality to protect his interests. His organization was responsible for hundreds of murders during the 1920s, as he systematically eliminated rivals, defectors, and anyone else who threatened his control of Chicago's underworld. The primary threat to Capone's dominance came from the North Side Gang, a criminal organization that controlled bootlegging operations on Chicago's North Side. The gang had been founded by Dean O'Banion, a charismatic and violent Irish-American criminal who had built a successful operation based on hijacking shipments from other bootleggers and maintaining control of his territory through intimidation and violence. When O'Banion was murdered in 1924 in a hit likely orchestrated by Capone, leadership of the North Side Gang passed to Earl Jaime Weiss, who continued the organization's aggressive tactics and maintained its rivalry with Capone's South Side operation. After Weiss was killed in 1926, control of the gang eventually passed to George Bugs Moran, a violent and unpredictable criminal who would become Capone's most persistent enemy. Moran, born Adelard Coonan in 1893, was known for his quick temper and his willingness to use violence to solve problems. Unlike Capone, who maintained at least a facade of respectability, Moran made no attempt to hide his criminal activities or cultivate public support. He was a pure predator who saw bootlegging as simply another form of robbery. The conflict between Capone and Moran intensified throughout the late 1920s, as each man sought to expand his territory at the expense of the other. The war between their organizations claimed dozens of lives and created a climate of fear and violence that made Chicago synonymous with gangster brutality. By early 1929, Capone had decided that the ongoing war with the North Side Gang was bad for business and needed to be ended decisively. Moran's organization had been weakened by years of conflict and police pressure, but it still posed a significant threat to Capone's operations. More importantly, Moran himself remained a powerful symbol of resistance to Capone's authority, and his continued survival encouraged other potential rivals. Capone began planning an operation that would eliminate Moran and his top lieutenants in a single stroke, effectively decapitating the North Side Gang and ending the threat they posed to his empire. The plan would require careful coordination and precise timing, but if successful, it would cement Capone's control over Chicago's underworld. The opportunity came when Capone's organization learned that Moran was expecting a valuable shipment of hijacked whiskey to arrive at his warehouse headquarters on North Clark Street. The shipment, stolen from a Detroit bootlegger, was worth approximately $57,000, a significant sum that made it worth Moran's personal attention. Capone's plan was elegant in its simplicity. His men would pose as police officers conducting a raid on the warehouse, disarm Moran and his associates, and then execute them while they stood helplessly against the wall. The fake police uniforms would not only allow the killers to approach their targets without suspicion, but would also create confusion afterward, as witnesses would report that the victims had been killed by law enforcement officers. The execution of the plan was entrusted to some of Capone's most reliable and ruthless killers. The team was led by Jack McGurn, Capone's chief enforcer, who had a personal grudge against the North Side Gang stemming from the murder of his stepfather years earlier. McGurn was known for his intelligence and organizational skills, making him the ideal choice to coordinate the complex operation. The actual killing was to be carried out by Fred Killer Burke, a professional assassin who worked for Capone's organization, and several other gunmen whose identities have never been definitively established. Burke was an experienced killer who had been involved in numerous gangland murders and could be trusted to carry out the execution efficiently and without complications. To maintain plausible deniability, Capone himself would be in Florida at the time of the massacre, establishing an alibi that would make it impossible to connect him directly to the killings. This was a standard practice for Capone, who rarely participated directly in violent operations, but preferred to maintain distance while his subordinates carried out his orders. The plan also called for some of the killers to wear police uniforms, while others would dress as civilians who were supposedly being arrested. This would create the illusion of a legitimate police raid and would explain the presence of armed men at the warehouse to any witnesses who might observe the operation. The morning of February 14, 1929, was bitterly cold in Chicago, with temperatures well below freezing and a layer of fresh snow covering the streets. The harsh weather meant that fewer people would be on the streets, providing additional cover for the planned operation. At the SMC Cartage Company warehouse at 2122 North Clark Street, 7 men gathered for the meeting about the expected whiskey shipment. The warehouse served as the headquarters for Moran's bootlegging operations and was a natural location for conducting business away from prying eyes. The men who assembled that morning represented the core leadership of the Northside Gang. Frank Gusenberg, Moran's chief enforcer and one of his most trusted associates. Pete Gusenberg, Frank's brother, and another key member of the organization. Adam Heyer, the gang's bookkeeper and business manager. Reinhard Schwimmer, an optometrist who associated with the gang and sometimes provided them with information. Albert Kachelek, also known as James Clark, one of Moran's bodyguards. Albert Weinshank, who resembled Moran physically and may have been mistaken for the gang leader by the killers. John May, a mechanic who worked for the gang and maintained their vehicles. Notably absent from the gathering was Bugs Moran himself, who was running late for the meeting due to the weather and traffic conditions. This stroke of luck would save his life and allow him to later provide investigators with crucial information about his organization's enemies. At approximately 10:30 a.m., a black Cadillac pulled up in front of the warehouse, and 4 men got out. 2 were dressed as Chicago police officers in full uniform, while 2 others wore civilian clothes but carried badges identifying them as detectives. The uniforms and badges were authentic, likely stolen from the Chicago Police Department or purchased from corrupt officers. The 4 men entered the warehouse and announced that they were conducting a raid. The 7 men inside, accustomed to occasional police harassment that was usually resolved with bribes, complied with orders to face the wall with their hands raised. This was a routine they had experienced many times before, and they expected to be released after paying the appropriate bribes to the arresting officers. However, this was not a legitimate police raid. Once the victims were lined up against the north wall of the warehouse, the fake officers opened fire with Thompson's submachine guns and shotguns, unleashing a devastating barrage that killed 6 of the men instantly and mortally wounded the 7th. The killers fired more than 70 rounds in the space of just a few minutes, ensuring that none of their targets would survive to identify them or testify about what had happened. The violence was systematic and thorough, with each victim struck multiple times to guarantee death. After the shooting stopped, the fake detectives raised their hands as if they were under arrest, while the fake uniformed officers escorted them from the building at gunpoint. This charade was performed for the benefit of any witnesses who might be watching, creating the impression that the uniformed officers had interrupted a crime in progress and arrested the perpetrators. The bodies were discovered shortly after 11 a.m. when neighbors, concerned about the sound of gunfire, called the police. The first officers to arrive at the scene found a massacre that exceeded anything they had previously encountered in Chicago's violent gang wars. The 7 victims lay in pools of blood against the warehouse wall, their bodies torn apart by the concentrated gunfire. The scene was so brutal that even experienced homicide detectives were shaken by what they found. The precision and cold-blooded nature of the execution made it clear that this was not the result of a spontaneous shootout, but rather a carefully planned assassination. One victim, Frank Gusenberg, was still alive when police arrived, though he had been shot 14 times and was dying. True to the gangster code of silence, Gusenberg refused to identify his attackers, telling police no one shot me, even as he lay bleeding to death. He died 3 hours later without providing any useful information about the killers. The discovery of the massacre sent shockwaves through Chicago and the nation. While gangland killings were common during Prohibition, the scale and brutality of the St. Valentine's Day massacre was unprecedented. The fact that 7 men had been executed in such a cold-blooded manner horrified the public and generated enormous pressure for law enforcement to bring the killers to justice. The Chicago Police Department launched what became one of the largest murder investigations in the city's history, assigning dozens of detectives to the case and offering substantial rewards for information leading to the arrest of the killers. However, the investigation was hampered by the wall of silence that surrounded Chicago's underworld and by the corruption that made many police officers unreliable partners in the pursuit of justice. Despite these obstacles, investigators were able to piece together important details about how the massacre had been carried out. Witnesses had seen the fake police car and the men in uniform, and ballistics evidence showed that the killings had been carried out with Thompson's submachine guns, weapons that were commonly used by both criminals and law enforcement officers. The investigation also revealed that the massacre had been a case of mistaken identity, at least partially. Albert Weinshank, one of the victims, bore a strong physical resemblance to Bugs Moran and may have been the primary target. When the killers saw Weinshank at the warehouse, they may have believed they were about to eliminate their main target. However, even if the killers had been confused about Moran's presence, they had still succeeded in devastating his organization. The massacre had eliminated most of Moran's key lieutenants and had effectively ended the Northside Gang as a significant force in Chicago's underworld. The St. Valentine's Day massacre generated unprecedented public outrage and media attention, transforming what had previously been viewed as a local Chicago problem into a national scandal. Newspapers across the country ran detailed accounts of the killings, complete with photographs of the crime scene that shocked readers and created demands for action against organized crime. The brutality of the massacre and its occurrence on Valentine's Day created a particularly powerful symbolic impact. The contrast between a day associated with love and romance and the cold-blooded execution of 7 men highlighted the savagery that had come to characterize Chicago's gang wars. Public opinion, which had previously been somewhat tolerant of bootleggers who were seen as providing a service that people wanted, shifted dramatically against organized crime. The massacre demonstrated that the violence associated with illegal alcohol was not confined to criminals, but posed a broader threat to public safety and social order. The public outrage created enormous political pressure for law enforcement and government officials to take serious action against organized crime. Politicians who had previously been content to accept bribes and look the other way now found themselves under intense scrutiny and pressure to demonstrate that they were serious about combating gangster violence. The St. Valentine's Day massacre marked a turning point in the federal government's approach to organized crime. Prior to 1929, federal law enforcement agencies had played a relatively minor role in combating gangster violence, leaving such matters primarily to local authorities. However, the national attention generated by the massacre and the obvious inability of local authorities to deal with the problem created pressure for federal intervention. The Treasury Department, under the leadership of Secretary Andrew Mellon, began to focus more intensively on Al Capone and his organization. Rather than pursuing murder charges, which would have been difficult to prove in court, federal agents concentrated on tax evasion, which offered a more reliable path to conviction. The Internal Revenue Service began a detailed examination of Capone's finances, seeking to prove that he had failed to pay taxes on his substantial illegal income. This approach had the advantage of avoiding many of the problems associated with traditional criminal investigations, such as intimidated witnesses and corrupt local officials. The federal investigation was led by Eliot Ness and his team of prohibition agents, who became known as the Untouchables due to their supposed immunity to corruption. While Ness's team focused primarily on disrupting Capone's bootlegging operations, their work complemented the tax investigation and helped build pressure on Capone's organization. While the St. Valentine's Day massacre had eliminated Capone's primary rival and consolidated his control over Chicago's underworld, it also marked the beginning of his downfall. The public outrage generated by the killings made Capone a national symbol of everything that was wrong with organized crime and created irresistible pressure for his prosecution. The federal tax investigation gradually built a strong case against Capone, documenting his substantial income and his failure to pay taxes on those earnings. Unlike the murder charges that had previously been brought against him, tax evasion could be proven through financial records and did not require the testimony of witnesses who might be intimidated or killed. In 1931, Capone was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. His conviction marked the end of his criminal empire and demonstrated that even the most powerful gangsters were not above the law. The success of the federal case against Capone would serve as a model for future prosecutions of organized crime figures. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, combined with the stock market crash of October 1929 and the beginning of the Great Depression, marked the end of the freewheeling gangster era of the 1920s. The economic collapse reduced the resources available for law enforcement corruption, while the public mood shifted away from the celebration of lawlessness that had characterized much of the previous decade. The repeal of prohibition in 1933 eliminated the primary source of income for many criminal organizations, forcing them to find new illegal activities or face dissolution. While organized crime did not disappear, it never again achieved the level of public visibility and brazen violence that had characterized the Capone era. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre has become one of the most famous crimes in American history, symbolizing both the violence of the Prohibition era and the corruption that allowed organized crime to flourish. The image of 7 men lined up against a warehouse wall and gunned down in cold blood has become an iconic representation of gangster brutality. The massacre also demonstrated the importance of federal law enforcement in combating organized crime. The success of the tax evasion case against Capone showed that federal agencies could succeed where local authorities had failed, establishing precedents that would be used in future prosecutions of criminal organizations. The case has been the subject of countless books, movies, and television shows, many of which have taken significant liberties with the historical facts. While these fictional portrayals have helped keep the story alive in popular culture, they have also contributed to widespread misconceptions about what actually happened and who was responsible. Despite decades of investigation and speculation, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre remains officially unsolved. While most historians and law enforcement experts believe that Al Capone ordered the killings and that they were carried out by members of his organization, no one was ever convicted of the murders. Several suspects were identified over the years, including Fred Killer Burke, Jack McGurn, and others associated with Capone's organization. However, the evidence against these men was largely circumstantial, and the witnesses who might have provided crucial testimony were either dead, intimidated, or unwilling to cooperate with authorities. The unsolved nature of the case has contributed to its enduring fascination and has spawned numerous theories about who was responsible and how the killings were carried out. While the basic facts of the massacre are well established, many details remain mysterious, ensuring that the case continues to generate interest and debate. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre of February 14, 1929, stands as one of the most significant and shocking crimes of the 20th century, representing the pinnacle of Prohibition-era violence and the brutal excesses of organized crime. The cold-blooded execution of 7 men in a Chicago warehouse horrified the nation and marked a turning point in the war between law enforcement and the criminal organizations that had flourished during the 1920s. While Al Capone succeeded in eliminating his primary rival and consolidating his control over Chicago's underworld, the massacre ultimately contributed to his downfall by generating the public outrage and political pressure that made his continued operation impossible. The federal prosecution that followed demonstrated that no criminal, regardless of power or influence, was above the law. The massacre also revealed the devastating consequences of Prohibition, which had created conditions that allowed organized crime to flourish and had corrupted the institutions that were supposed to protect public safety. The violence and corruption that characterized the bootlegging era provided powerful arguments for the repeal of the 18th Amendment and the end of the noble experiment of Prohibition. Today, nearly a century after the massacre, the empty lot where the SMC Cartage Company warehouse once stood serves as a reminder of one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. While the building was demolished decades ago, The memory of what happened there continues to fascinate and horrify people around the world. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre represents more than just a gangland execution. It symbolizes the corruption, violence, and lawlessness that can flourish when government fails to maintain effective control over criminal activity. The lessons learned from this tragedy continue to influence law enforcement strategies and public policy, serving as a permanent reminder of the importance of maintaining the rule of law and protecting society from organized criminal violence. The 7 men who died in that Chicago warehouse on Valentine's Day, 1929, were criminals who had chosen to live by violence. But their brutal executions shocked the conscience of a nation and helped bring about the end of one of the most violent eras in American history. Their deaths marked both the triumph and the beginning of the end of Al Capone's criminal empire, demonstrating that even the most powerful criminals ultimately face justice, whether at the hands of their enemies or the law they sought to defy. Story 5, The Patty Hearst Kidnapping, February 4th, 1974. The evening of February 4th, 1974, began quietly for 19-year-old Patricia Campbell Hearst as she prepared dinner in her Berkeley apartment with her fiancé, Stephen Weed. The granddaughter of newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst was a typical college student at the University of California, Berkeley, enjoying the freedom of young adulthood while pursuing her studies in art history. At 9 p.m., their peaceful domestic routine was shattered when 3 armed members of the little-known Symbionese Liberation Army burst through their door, beginning one of the most bizarre and controversial kidnapping cases in American history. What followed would captivate the nation for nearly 2 years and challenge fundamental assumptions about victimhood, coercion, and criminal responsibility. The case of Patty Hearst would evolve from a straightforward kidnapping into a complex psychological drama involving revolutionary politics, Stockholm Syndrome, and questions about whether victims of extreme coercion could be held responsible for crimes they committed while under duress. The transformation of America's newspaper princess into Tanya, a gun-wielding revolutionary who robbed banks alongside her captors, would become one of the most debated criminal cases of the 20th century. To understand the significance of Patty Hearst's kidnapping, one must first understand the enormous wealth and influence of the Hearst family empire. Patricia Campbell Hearst was born on February 20th, 1954, into one of America's most powerful media dynasties. The granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, whose newspaper and media empire had made him one of the most influential figures in early 20th century America. William Randolph Hearst had built his fortune through aggressive journalism and shrewd business practices, creating a media empire that included newspapers, magazines, radio stations, and film studios. By the time of his death in 1951, the Hearst Corporation controlled one of the largest media conglomerations in the world, and the family's wealth was estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Patty's father, Randolph Apperson Hearst, had inherited significant wealth and influence within the family business, serving as president of the Hearst Corporation and maintaining the family's position among America's elite. The Hearsts lived in luxury, with multiple homes, extensive art collections, and all the privileges that enormous wealth could provide. Patricia herself had grown up in this world of privilege, attending exclusive private schools and enjoying opportunities that were available to only a tiny fraction of American children. However, despite her family's conservative political leanings and establishment connections, Patty had been drawn to the counterculture movements of the 1960s and early 1970s, attending UC Berkeley, a hotbed of student activism and political radicalism. By 1974, Patty was living with her fiancé, Stephen Weed, in a modest apartment near the Berkeley campus, pursuing a relatively normal college lifestyle despite her family's wealth and prominence. She had maintained some distance from her family's conservative politics and had shown interest in more liberal causes, though she was not considered particularly radical or politically active by those who knew her. The organization responsible for Patty Hearst's kidnapping was the Symbionese Liberation Army, a small but violent revolutionary group that had emerged from the radical political movements of the early 1970s. The SLA, founded in 1973, was led by Donald DeFreeze, an escaped convict who had adopted the nom de guerre General Field Marshal Cinque and who preached a bizarre mixture of black nationalism, anti-capitalism, and violent revolution. The SLA's ideology was a confused amalgamation of various radical theories that called for the violent overthrow of the fascist insect that they claimed controlled American society. The group's manifesto demanded the elimination of capitalism, the liberation of all prisoners, and the establishment of a revolutionary socialist state. However, their political program was often incoherent and seemed to change depending on the circumstances and the whims of their leadership. Despite their grandiose name and revolutionary rhetoric, the SLA was actually a tiny organization with fewer than a dozen active members at any given time. Most of the members were young, white, middle-class radicals who had become disillusioned with mainstream society and had been drawn to increasingly extreme forms of political action. The group had gained notoriety in November 1973 when they assassinated Marcus Foster, the first African-American superintendent of the Oakland school system. The murder of Foster, who was widely respected in the African-American community, demonstrated the SLA's confused political thinking and their willingness to use violence against targets that seemed to contradict their stated goals of liberation and social justice. The Foster assassination had brought the SLA to the attention of law enforcement agencies, but the group remained largely unknown to the general public until they kidnapped Patty Hearst. The kidnapping would transform them from a minor radical group into one of the most notorious terrorist organizations in American history. The SLA's decision to kidnap Patty Hearst was motivated by several factors, including their need for publicity, their desire to obtain ransom money to fund their operations, and their belief that targeting a member of America's elite would strike a blow against the establishment they sought to destroy. The planning for the kidnapping was relatively simple, reflecting both the group's limited resources and their amateur approach to criminal operations. SLA members had conducted surveillance of Patty's apartment building and had learned her routine, determining that she and Stephen Weed were usually home alone in the evenings and that the building's security was minimal. On the evening of February 4th, 1974, three SLA members, Donald DeFries, Nancy Ling Perry, and Camilla Hall, approached the Hearst apartment armed with weapons and prepared to carry out the kidnapping. Their plan was to quickly overpower any resistance, abduct Patty, and escape before law enforcement could respond. At approximately 9 p.m., the kidnappers forced their way into the apartment, where they found Patty and Stephen eating dinner. The attack was swift and violent, with the kidnappers beating Stephen Weed severely while restraining Patty and preparing to remove her from the apartment. Neighbors who heard the commotion called police, but the kidnappers had anticipated this response and worked quickly to complete their mission. They blindfolded Patty, forced her into the trunk of a waiting car, and drove away before police arrived at the scene. Stephen Weed, despite his injuries, was able to provide investigators with descriptions of the attackers and details about how the kidnapping had been carried out. However, the kidnappers had worn disguises and had taken precautions to avoid leaving evidence that could be used to identify them or track their movements. The SLA's ransom demands, delivered through audio recordings sent to Bay Area radio stations, revealed the group's political motivations and their desire to use the kidnapping as a platform for promoting their revolutionary agenda. Rather than simply demanding money for Patty's return, the SLA made complex political demands that were designed to generate publicity and advance their cause. The initial demand was for the Hearst family to distribute $70 worth of food to every needy person in California, a demand that would have cost an estimated $400 million and was clearly impossible to fulfill. The SLA claimed that this demand would demonstrate their commitment to helping the poor and oppressed, while also showing the Hearst family's callousness if they refused to comply. The food distribution demand was accompanied by political statements condemning the Hearst media empire as a tool of capitalist oppression and demanding that the family acknowledge their role in perpetuating social inequality. The SLA used Patty's kidnapping as an opportunity to deliver lengthy lectures about American imperialism, corporate exploitation, and the need for revolutionary change. When it became clear that the massive food distribution demand could not be met, the SLA modified their demands, eventually accepting a smaller food distribution program that cost the Hearst family approximately $2 million. However, even after this ransom was paid, the SLA refused to release Patty, claiming that she had chosen to remain with them voluntarily. The evolving ransom demands demonstrated the SLA's amateurish approach to criminal operations and their primary interest in using the kidnapping for propaganda purposes rather than financial gain. The group seemed more interested in generating media attention and promoting their political agenda than in the practical aspects of conducting a successful kidnapping operation. During her initial weeks in captivity, Patty Hearst was held in a closet-sized space where she was blindfolded, bound, and subjected to constant psychological pressure from her captors. The SLA members took turns guarding her and indoctrinating her with their revolutionary ideology, using a combination of threats, isolation, and psychological manipulation to break down her resistance. The conditions of Patty's captivity were designed to create complete dependence on her captors and to eliminate her connection to her previous life and identity. She was given a new name, Tanya, after the nom de guerre of a Cuban revolutionary, and was told that her previous life as Patricia Hearst was over and that she must choose between joining the SLA or being executed as an enemy of the people. The psychological pressure applied by the SLA was intense and unrelenting. Patty was subjected to political lectures, forced to listen to recordings of SLA propaganda, and threatened with death if she failed to demonstrate sufficient commitment to the revolutionary cause. She was also isolated from any outside contact and was completely dependent on her captors for food, water, and basic human needs. During this period, Patty later claimed, she was also sexually assaulted by members of the SLA, adding another layer of trauma and psychological manipulation to her captivity. The combination of physical abuse, psychological pressure, and complete isolation created conditions that mental health experts would later describe as conducive to the development of Stockholm Syndrome and other forms of trauma bonding. The transformation that occurred during this period would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. Supporters of Patty would argue that she was the victim of sophisticated psychological manipulation and coercion that left her with no choice but to comply with her captors' demands. Critics would contend that she had voluntarily joined the SLA and had participated willingly in their criminal activities. After approximately 2 months in captivity, Patty Hearst made a stunning announcement that shocked her family and captivated the nation. In an audio recording released to the media on April 3, 1974, she declared that she had chosen to join the SLA and would be taking the revolutionary name Tanya in honor of Che Guevara's fallen comrade. "I have chosen to stay and fight," Patty announced in the recording. "I have been given the choice of being released or joining the forces of the Symbionese Liberation Army and fighting for my freedom and the freedom of all oppressed people. I have chosen to stay and fight." The recording continued with Patty denouncing her family as pig Hearsts and expressing her commitment to the SLA's revolutionary cause. She criticized her parents' wealth and privilege, declared her opposition to capitalism and imperialism, and announced her intention to participate in SLA operations against the establishment. This transformation from kidnapping victim to revolutionary was unprecedented in American criminal history and generated enormous media attention and public debate. Many people found it impossible to believe that someone could undergo such a dramatic change in political beliefs and personal identity in such a short period of time. The Hearst family and their supporters maintained that Patty was still being held against her will and that her statements were the result of coercion and brainwashing. They argued that no one could be expected to resist the kind of psychological pressure that the SLA had applied, and that Patty's apparent conversion was evidence of the trauma she had endured rather than her genuine beliefs. However, skeptics pointed to the detailed nature of Patty's political statements and her apparent knowledge of SLA ideology as evidence that her conversion might be genuine. They argued that someone who was simply being forced to read prepared statements would not have been able to demonstrate such familiarity with revolutionary theory and political analysis. The most dramatic and controversial phase of the Patty Hearst case began on April 15, 1974, when she participated in an armed robbery of the Hibernia Bank in San Francisco. Security cameras captured images of Patty, dressed in revolutionary garb and carrying an assault rifle, participating actively in the robbery alongside other SLA members. The bank robbery footage, which was broadcast repeatedly on television news programs, showed Patty pointing her weapon at bank employees and customers, while other SLA members collected money from the tellers. Her body language and behavior suggested active participation rather than reluctant compliance, fueling debates about whether she was still a victim or had become a willing participant in criminal activities. During the robbery, Patty could be heard shouting revolutionary slogans and directing customers to lie on the floor. Her voice and demeanor seemed confident and committed, quite different from what might be expected from someone who was being forced to participate against her will. The SLA netted approximately $10,000 from the Hibernia bank robbery, money that they used to fund their operations and to support their underground lifestyle. However, the robbery's primary value to the group was propaganda, as it demonstrated that they had successfully converted America's newspaper princess into a revolutionary fighter. A second bank robbery occurred on May 16, 1974, when SLA members robbed the Crocker National Bank in Carmichael, California. Although Patty did not directly participate in this robbery, she served as a lookout and getaway driver, further demonstrating her integration into the group's criminal operations. During the Crocker Bank robbery, customer Myrna Opsal was shot and killed by SLA member Emily Harris, marking the first time that the group's criminal activities had resulted in a death since the Marcus Foster assassination. Patty's role in this robbery, even as a lookout, made her potentially liable for felony murder charges. The SLA's campaign of bank robberies and revolutionary violence came to a dramatic end on May 17, 1974, when 6 members of the group died in a massive shootout with Los Angeles police. The confrontation began when SLA members Bill and Emily Harris attempted to shoplift from a sporting goods store and were confronted by store security. Patty, who was waiting in a van outside the store, opened fire with an automatic weapon to help the Harrises escape, demonstrating her continued commitment to the group and her willingness to use violence on their behalf. The 3 then fled to a safe house in South Los Angeles, where other SLA members were hiding. Law enforcement agencies had been tracking the SLA's movements and quickly surrounded the safe house, leading to a standoff that was broadcast live on television. The siege lasted for hours, with SLA members refusing to surrender and engaging in periodic gun battles with police. The confrontation ended when the safe house caught fire, apparently from tear gas canisters or incendiary devices used by police. 6 SLA members, including leader Donald DeFreeze, died in the fire and shootout, effectively ending the organization as a functioning criminal group. Patty was not present during the final shootout, having fled to a different location with Bill and Emily Harris. The death of most of her SLA comrades left her in a difficult position, as she was now a fugitive from justice with limited resources and support. Following the Los Angeles shootout, Patty spent more than a year living underground with the surviving SLA members and other radical supporters. During this period, she assumed various false identities and moved frequently to avoid capture by law enforcement agencies. The underground period was marked by continued criminal activity, including additional robberies and other illegal acts committed to support the fugitive lifestyle. Patty's participation in these activities further complicated her legal situation and provided additional evidence that prosecutors would later use to argue that she had willingly joined the SLA. During this time, Patty also developed romantic relationships with other radicals, including Willie Wolfe, who had died in the Los Angeles shootout, and later Stephen Celaya, demonstrating her continued integration into the radical underground community. The life of a fugitive was difficult and stressful, requiring constant vigilance and frequent moves to avoid detection. Patty later described this period as one of continued fear and uncertainty, though she maintained her commitment to the revolutionary cause and her hostility toward her family and former life. Law enforcement agencies conducted an intensive manhunt for the surviving SLA members, using advanced surveillance techniques and offering substantial rewards for information leading to their capture. The high-profile nature of the case ensured that the search received enormous resources and public attention. Patty Hearst's life as a fugitive came to an end on September 18, 1975, when she was arrested along with Emily and Bill Harris at an apartment in San Francisco. The arrest was the result of an extensive FBI investigation that had gradually closed in on the surviving SLA members. The FBI had been monitoring associates of the radical underground and had developed intelligence about safe houses and supporters who were helping the fugitives. The arrest came after months of surveillance and intelligence gathering that had gradually narrowed the search area. When agents arrested Patty, they found her in possession of weapons and false identification documents, evidence that prosecutors would later use to demonstrate her continued commitment to criminal activity. Her behavior during the arrest was reportedly calm and defiant, consistent with someone who had accepted their fate rather than someone who was relieved to be rescued. The arrest generated enormous media attention, with news organizations providing extensive coverage of Patty's capture and speculation about what her trial would reveal about her motivations and mental state during her time with the SLA. Patty Hearst's trial preparation involves some of the most prominent legal and psychiatric experts in the country, as her defense team sought to build a case based on coercion, Stockholm syndrome, and the psychological effects of her kidnapping and captivity. The defense strategy centered on the argument that Patty had been the victim of sophisticated psychological manipulation and coercion that had left her unable to make rational decisions about her behavior. Her attorneys argued that the conditions of her captivity had created a form of trauma bonding that made her psychologically dependent on her captors. Leading psychiatrists and psychologists testified about the effects of prolonged captivity, isolation, and psychological pressure on human behavior. They explained how victims of extreme coercion could come to identify with their captors and could be induced to participate in criminal activities against their true will. The prosecution, led by U.S. Attorney James Browning, argued that Patty had willingly joined the SLA and had participated voluntarily in their criminal activities. They pointed to her active participation in bank robberies, her political statements, and her continued criminal activity after the Los Angeles shootout as evidence of her genuine conversion to the revolutionary cause. The case presented unprecedented legal questions about criminal responsibility and the limits of coercion as a defense. Courts had rarely been asked to consider whether victims of extreme psychological manipulation could be held responsible for crimes they committed while under duress. Patty Hearst's trial began on January 15, 1976, and immediately became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in American history. The courtroom was packed with reporters, and the trial received extensive daily coverage in newspapers and television news programs across the country. The prosecution presented evidence of Patty's active participation in SLA criminal activities, including the bank robbery footage that showed her wielding weapons and directing customers. They argued that her behavior was inconsistent with someone who was being forced to participate against her will. Prosecutors also presented evidence of Patty's political statements and her apparent knowledge of revolutionary ideology, arguing that someone who was simply being coerced would not have demonstrated such familiarity with radical theory and analysis. The defense countered with expert testimony about the psychological effects of kidnapping, captivity, and coercion. Psychiatrists explained how the conditions of Patty's captivity could have created Stockholm syndrome and other forms of trauma bonding that would explain her apparent conversion to the SLA cause. Patty herself testified in her own defense, describing the conditions of her captivity and the psychological pressure that had been applied by her captors. Her testimony was emotional and detailed, providing insights into the trauma she had experienced and the methods used by the SLA to break down her resistance. However, Patty's testimony was also controversial, as she invoked her Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination when asked about certain aspects of her time with the SLA. This refusal to answer questions was seen by some observers as evidence that she had something to hide about her voluntary participation in criminal activities. On March 20, 1976, the jury found Patty Hearst guilty of armed bank robbery and using a firearm in the commission of a felony. The verdict was a stunning defeat for the defense and a vindication of the prosecution's argument that she had willingly participated in SLA criminal activities. The jury's decision reflected their conclusion that while Patty may have initially been a victim of kidnapping and coercion, she had eventually made a conscious choice to join the SLA and participate in their criminal activities. The evidence of her active participation in bank robberies and her continued criminal activity after the Los Angeles shootout had convinced them that she was not simply an unwilling victim. Judge Oliver Carter sentenced Patty to 7 years in federal prison, a relatively light sentence that reflected his recognition of the unique circumstances of her case. However, the conviction meant that America's newspaper heiress would become a federal prisoner, serving time for crimes committed while she claimed to be under duress. The verdict generated enormous controversy and debate, with supporters arguing that Patty had been victimized twice, first by her kidnappers and then by a legal system that failed to understand the psychological effects of extreme coercion. Critics maintain that the verdict was appropriate and that no one should be above the law, regardless of their background or the circumstances that led to their criminal behavior. Patty Hearst's legal team immediately began the appeals process, arguing that her conviction was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the psychological effects of kidnapping and coercion. They contended that the jury had not properly considered the expert testimony about Stockholm Syndrome and trauma bonding. However, the appeals courts upheld her conviction, finding that the jury had been properly instructed about the relevant legal standards and that there was sufficient evidence to support their verdict. The courts ruled that while Patty's kidnapping and captivity were relevant factors, they did not automatically excuse her participation in criminal activities. Patty served 22 months in federal prison before President Jimmy Carter commuted her sentence in February 1979. Carter's decision was based on his conclusion that she had suffered enough and that the unique circumstances of her case warranted clemency. The commutation was controversial, with critics arguing that it sent the wrong message about accountability for criminal behavior. However, supporters praised Carter's recognition of the extraordinary circumstances that had led to Patty's crimes and his willingness to show mercy to someone who had been victimized before becoming a perpetrator. After her release from prison, Patty Hearst attempted to rebuild her life and distance herself from the notoriety of her criminal case. She married her former bodyguard, Bernard Shaw, and had 2 children, seeking to establish a normal family life away from the public attention that had dominated her young adulthood. Patty wrote a memoir about her experiences, titled Every Secret Thing, which provided her account of the kidnapping, her time with the SLA, and her perspective on the trial and its aftermath. The book offered insights into her psychological state during her captivity and her continued belief that she had been a victim rather than a willing participant. In 2001, President Bill Clinton granted Patty a full presidential pardon, officially clearing her criminal record and acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances of her case. Clinton's decision was based on his conclusion that she had been sufficiently punished and that her case presented unique factors that warranted clemency. The pardon was generally well received, with many observers concluding that enough time had passed and that Patty had successfully rehabilitated herself and contributed positively to society since her release from prison. The Patty Hearst case became a landmark example of Stockholm Syndrome, a psychological phenomenon in which hostages develop positive feelings toward their captors as a survival mechanism. Mental health experts have studied her case extensively as an example of how extreme coercion and psychological manipulation can affect human behavior. The conditions of Patty's captivity, including isolation, psychological pressure, dependence on captors for survival, and the threat of death, created a textbook example of the circumstances that can lead to Stockholm Syndrome. Her apparent conversion to the SLA cause and her participation in criminal activities can be understood as adaptive responses to an extremely threatening situation. However, the case also highlighted the limitations of Stockholm Syndrome as a legal defense and the difficulty of determining when someone's actions are the result of genuine choice versus psychological coercion. Courts have generally been reluctant to accept Stockholm Syndrome as a complete defense to criminal charges, though it may be considered as a mitigating factor in sentencing. The Patty Hearst case has influenced how law enforcement agencies approach hostage situations and how mental health professionals understand the psychological effects of captivity and coercion. It has also contributed to legal debates about criminal responsibility and the limits of coercion as a defense. The Patty Hearst case received unprecedented media coverage and became a cultural phenomenon that reflected broader social and political tensions of the 1970s. The transformation of America's newspaper princess into a revolutionary bank robber captured the public imagination and sparked intense debates about privilege, politics, and personal responsibility. The extensive media coverage included daily newspaper reports, television news coverage, and magazine articles that analyzed every aspect of the case. The bank robbery footage in particular became an iconic image that was repeatedly broadcast and analyzed for clues about Patty's mental state and motivations. The case also became a symbol of the social upheaval of the 1960s and 1970s, representing the generational conflicts and political divisions that characterized the era. Patty's apparent rejection of her privileged background and her adoption of revolutionary politics reflected broader themes of rebellion against authority and establishment values. The cultural impact of the case extended to popular culture, inspiring books, movies, and television shows that explored the themes of kidnapping, coercion, and identity transformation. The case became a touchstone for discussions about victimhood, agency, and the complex relationships between perpetrators and victims. The Patty Hearst case had significant implications for both legal doctrine and social understanding of criminal responsibility. The case raised fundamental questions about when victims of extreme coercion can be held responsible for crimes they commit while under duress. The legal system's handling of the case established important precedents about the limits of coercion as a defense and the standards that must be met to excuse criminal behavior based on psychological manipulation. While courts acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances of Patty's case, they ultimately concluded that she could be held responsible for her actions. The case also influenced how society understands the relationship between victims and perpetrators, highlighting the complex psychological dynamics that can develop in extreme situations. It demonstrated that the traditional categories of victim and criminal might not be adequate to address cases involving sophisticated psychological manipulation. The social implications of the case extended to discussions about privilege, justice, and equality before the law. Some critics argued that Patty's wealth and social status had influenced both the prosecution's approach to her case and the public's sympathy for her situation, raising questions about whether justice was applied equally regardless of social class. The kidnapping of Patty Hearst on February 4, 1974, and her subsequent transformation into Tanya, a revolutionary bank robber, remains one of the most complex and controversial criminal cases in American history. The case challenged fundamental assumptions about victimhood, criminal responsibility, and the limits of human psychology under extreme duress. Patty's journey from privileged heiress to kidnapping victim to convicted felon to pardoned citizen reflected the social and political turbulence of the 1970s, while raising timeless questions about identity, agency, and the power of psychological manipulation. Her case became a landmark example of Stockholm Syndrome, while also demonstrating the limitations of psychological explanations for criminal behavior. The legal proceedings that followed her arrest established important precedents about coercion as a defense, while also affirming that extraordinary circumstances do not automatically excuse criminal behavior. The court's handling of her case reflected the difficulty of balancing sympathy for victims of extreme abuse with the need to maintain accountability for criminal actions. The extensive media coverage and public debate surrounding the case revealed deep divisions in American society about privilege, justice, and political violence. Patty's transformation from victim to perpetrator became a symbol of broader social upheavals, while also highlighting the complex psychological dynamics that can develop in extreme situations. Today, nearly 5 decades after her kidnapping, Patty Hearst's case continues to fascinate legal scholars, psychologists, and the general public. Her experience serves as a permanent reminder of the power of psychological manipulation and the complex relationships between victims and perpetrators in extreme circumstances. The case also stands as a testament to the possibility of redemption and rehabilitation, as Patty successfully rebuilt her life after serving her sentence and receiving a presidential pardon. Her transformation from notorious criminal to respected citizen demonstrates that people can overcome even the most traumatic experiences and contribute positively to society. The empty apartment in Berkeley where Patty Hearst was kidnapped that February evening in 1974 may seem unremarkable today, but it was the starting point for a journey that would challenge our understanding of victimhood, criminal responsibility, and the limits of human endurance under extreme psychological pressure. Her story remains a compelling reminder of how quickly and dramatically life can change, and how complex the relationships between victims and perpetrators can become in the real world of human psychology and criminal behavior. Let the hush of the night wrap around you, and know this: some stories don't end. They drift. They dream. They wait for you to listen again. Good night.